Today, I want to talk about a security concept that's based on defensive strategy that's been around for thousands of years. And it's often slightly misunderstood. If used properly, it can turbocharge your security strategy, help you defeat hackers, but most importantly, help you sleep at night. I am, of course, talking about defense in depth. Oh, and I also now have background music. Now, this video is a short summary of a LinkedIn article that I wrote. There's a lot more detail in that article. So if you're finding this interesting, jump across to my LinkedIn. I'll put the link in the description and you can see the article there that goes into a lot more depth. If you're familiar with my honest breach notifications on LinkedIn, you'll probably know that most of them are down to the failure of a single control. So for example, a user gets phished, they've not got multi-factor authentication or MFA, an attacker gets access to their inbox, or they browse to a website, they get malware, but they've got no endpoint detection and response, and that means an attacker can get into their organization. One control failure, and the breach occurs. Of course, in reality, these are quite unlikely. Most organizations have usually 2, 3, 4, maybe sometimes tens, hundreds of different security controls. But it wasn't that long ago that actually having single controls wasn't that uncommon. Firewalls were very popular if you go back 15, 20 years, and the concept was all around just keeping the bad people out, have a strong perimeter, have a strong firewall, but then once they were in, it was really easy to move around. There were very few other controls or technologies that could stop hackers. And back then, that was kind of okay. We were connected to the internet, but most attacks weren't that sophisticated. And of course, today we see pretty sophisticated attacks that will leverage numerous control failures or gaps in controls to gain access to organizations. And us as defenders, we've got lots of tech to try and stop those attackers. And when you take a big step back from your environment and look holistically at those controls and those technologies, those processes, those people, we get a better view of what our security is and how it works. And importantly for this concept, how those controls, how those technologies complement each other. And this is where we get the concept of defense in depth. Independent, overlapping controls. So if one fails, there's another the attacker will hit that will compensate and will hopefully stop them, or at least give a detection opportunity. Defense in depth is also super useful in this kind of age we find ourselves in with the concept of assumed breach. And this is where we just assume, because of the sophistication of attackers and complexity of our networks and infrastructure, somebody at some point will get in and start moving around. Therefore, we need different technologies and different controls to try and detect them and then also defeat them. So to understand the origins of defense in depth, we need to travel back in time to probably hundreds, maybe thousands of years back, to castles and fortifications. Now, if you live in the UK, you've probably visited a castle, be it on a school trip or a day out with your family, and they've all got a pretty common sort of pattern on how they're designed. So they have moats, they have large guard towers, they have big gates, they have drawbridges, they have big walls, they have inner walls, they have citadels. All these things are designed to not just make it hard to attack the castle, but increase the chances of success for defenders. So once someone's attacking your castle and they've gained access, gives you more opportunity to detect them and defeat them as well. And you know, back a few hundred years ago, thousands of years ago, if your castle gets taken, you're not just dealing with a data breach, you're probably dealing with maybe quite a sticky end. And when we think about defense in depth, there's three main principles. The first one is layered security, the second one is redundancy, and the third one is diversity and security. So in that first principle, talking about layered security, it's all about those independent overlapping layers of controls or technologies, policy standards, whatever it may be. So if an attacker is successful at one side, they might get through, they're going to hit something else. And that can cover a range of different areas I'll touch on a bit later in the video. And when we talk about redundancy, it's all about that thinking about failure. So what if one control is defeated, or technically it just stops working, and you'd be amazed about the amount of data breaches that have happened in the past that have been attributed to a control that might be in place but maybe isn't switched on or broke or isn't working as expected. And then lastly, diversity. And this is all about when we think about our layers or our rings of defense, having different categories of controls. So we might have technical controls, we might have more traditional cultural controls like e-learning or training for people. There might be policies, standards, physical controls. The more diversity we have, the more success we're likely to have in defeating attackers. So let's talk about some examples of defense in depth. And for me, this spans three categories. The first one is administrative, then technical, and then physical. Now, I love talking about administrative controls in the concept of defense in depth, it sounds a little bit counterintuitive because we talk about castles and physical things and technical controls. But there's loads of administrative work we can do in the background, lots of sensible governance work, risk work, standards, policies, etc. that help provide controls that can slow down attackers. Now next, as I said, we have technical controls, and that's traditionally what people think of when you talk about security and defense in depth, and that's your firewalls, your EDRs, your mail filters, your intrusion detection systems, all those traditional controls that we think of. And then lastly is the physical. So if you think about sites that you have, data centers, the physical access to IT equipment and to information, those controls, stuff like CCTV, locks, guards, gates, all that good stuff falls into that category. When thinking about defense in depth, I often like to think of it in the concept of inner and outer. Now, outside of our organization, where you can see, for instance, maybe our firewall, applications, services that we expose to the internet, there's not a great deal we can do about what hackers are doing out there. We can obviously deploy sensible policies and tools to stop them if they do come and attack us, but we can't influence easily that kind of world. But when we get into the inner part of our organizations, our networks, our infrastructure, our code, that's our ground. We control that. We can do, within reason, anything that we like in those spaces. And that's where I think when you start thinking in defense in depth terms, you can have real impact on your security strategy and your planning. So thinking about the future of defense in depth and what that means for us, I think having lots of these independent overlapping controls is great. It's a really good thing to do. It does increase your management overhead, of course. It increases your complexity, which itself we know is a enemy of just good IT management, let alone good security. But there's some things in the pipeline at the moment, new sort of technologies like XDR, SOAR, next-gen SIEM as well, that I think bring some real value and potential to improving defense in depth. One of the challenges, if you've got, let's say, 10 or 15 different controls out there that are collecting telemetry, they're generating alerts, they might be causing noise for you, being able to integrate them in one place like an XDR or a SIEM and then act on them using something like a SOAR, that actually feels quite appealing nowadays. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, explain defense in depth at a high level, the origins, the concepts and the principles that I think it applies to in information security. And for me, at the core of defense in depth, and I think where a lot of people maybe misinterpret it or misunderstand it, is this interconnectedness between people, process, and technology. It's really easy to go down the route of thinking of defense in depth in those layers of technical, independent, overlapping controls, but always think about your processes, maybe your standards, your policies, your governance, but critically your people as well. They are so key, we are so key to securing organizations. You can invest huge amounts in technology, but if you've not got the people and the processes to operate it properly, you're not going to succeed. So I hope you found this video useful. I certainly really enjoyed refreshing my knowledge on defense in depth and researching it today, and I'll see you again next time.